Welcome. Thank you all for coming out on a July night. Yeah, it is kind of a patriotic topic I decided for the summer. I definitely wanted to do George Washington. And as I announced last month, I'm going to follow up with Lincoln and probably my favorite president of all time, Teddy Roosevelt. So that'll be July, August, and September. But Washington is interesting because I already knew that there were aspects to Washington's life that most of us are not familiar with. If you haven't really sat down and read a biography of him and looked at him, you don't think of that as a picture of George Washington. No. Or that. Well, I'll make a confession. I've fed the prompts into AI. These are all 3A, because there is no Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington as a 16-year-old surveyor in the backwoods. Although that one does look like, that's an AI-generated picture, and it does look like him. That's sort of, I asked AI to, age him appropriately for his service in the Virginia Militia between the ages of 21 and 26. So, now that I've introduced that. So welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Let me say just a word or two about the Schaeffer Study Center first. Here are the more famous. There's the one. This is the famous Gilbert Stuart. It looks a lot like the Rembrandt Peale painting. So these two are actual paintings done of Washington as he sat and posed for them. So this is in 1776, just after his appointment as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He's 44 there. This is at 64 in his second term, just before he retired. This one is an AI, but I wanted one of Washington at the time of his inauguration when he was 57, because everybody commented on the physical effect of 2 terms in the presidency, that he looked by the end worn down. And I'll talk about that. We also think of him as obviously popular and beloved. If you've seen the John Adams series, you've already got a hint that that's not actually true for the second term. I'll talk about that in a minute. All right, Francis Schaeffer Study Center, founded in 2004. Our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. It is named for the influential theologian and apologist, Francis Schaeffer. And in addition to these lectures, we also offer a high school history, literature, art, and sciences program. Meets every week through the school year here at the church from about 7 in the morning till about 5 in the afternoon. We go through Western civilization, beginning with the ancient world in 9th grade and finishing with the 20th century in 12th grade. And I'm going to have to amend that because we're a quarter of the way through the 21st century now. It's time to start talking about the history of the last 25 years. I am Rob Shearer. I've been married for 47 years to the lovely Miss Cindy, who's my coach and fan and partner in crime, back in the back there. We have raised 12 children, 3 sons, 9 daughters. We have 21 grandchildren so far. And I've been a little bit of anything. A little bit of everything. I did get my training as a historian, undergrad and grad school. I've been a teacher and author for almost all of my life. I was a college professor for a while. I was city manager here in Mount Juliet for 7 years, back at the beginning of the century. We have a publishing company, and my wife and I are the co-directors of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. So, what's the most significant thing you already know about George Washington? First president. Yep.
Apparently he got gray hair really early.
He got gray hair early. Yes. He powdered it white. If you were in public office, to give yourself some gravity, and it wasn't a wig. It was his own hair. He wasn't wearing a powdered wig. It was his own hair powdered and pulled back in a little queue at the back. What else do you know?
He was tall.
He was tall. He's over 6 foot, which was unusual. The average height at the time was about 5'8", 5'9", so he was 2 or 3 inches taller than everybody.
He didn't like cherry trees.
He didn't. Well, that's a myth. That's a myth. The cherry tree story, nobody mentioned until about 30 years after he died. No one of his biographers put it into his biography about George's honesty and his relationship with his father. It probably did not happen. I did discover, though, that one of the other famous stories that we hear that he threw $1. I always thought it was Potomac, that he threw $1 coin across it, but it wasn't Potomac, because that would have been kind of ridiculous. Even at Mount Vernon, it's tidal, and the river is over a mile wide. No, he grew up across the Rappahannock from Fredericksburg. And the story is that he threw a silver dollar when he was still 11, 12 years old across the Rappahannock. Well, I pulled it up on Google Maps and got out and measured. It's only 100 feet wide. That's not even a football field. So it's at least plausible. The story might not have happened, but that one makes some sense because it's an illustration of his strength. He was always admired for his powerful physique, and he was known to be one of the best horsemen. Horseback riders of his age. What else do you know?
He was the commander of the Continental Army.
Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Yep.
Wasn't he in love with another woman before his wife?
Oh,
It was real.
Sally Fairfax. Yeah, and she was married to his best friend.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of speculation about that. He was in his 20s. There's some letters back and forth that Martha didn't burn, that got preserved. And so there's been some speculation over the years about to what extent his crush on Sally Fairfax might have involved more than just a little flirtation. It seems pretty clear it was just a flirtation. The odd thing is, Sally and her husband and he and Martha became good friends and traveled together, which seems implausible if there'd been anything more than just a little flirtation. But he did write some what would even now be considered probably some scandalous, flirtatious letters to her. He was single at the time, but she was married. Okay. I talked about our sources, the collected papers at the University of Virginia. They've published 75 volumes so far. That's projected to be 92 and complete. Freeman's biography is epic and detailed in 7 volumes. There we go, 1948 to 1957. Yeah, Mason Weems, Pastor Weems, is the one who invented the cherry tree story. And the only one who tells, or the first one who tells the silver dollar story, which, because the cherry tree story we're pretty sure is made up, people are a little doubtful now about the silver dollar as well. There are lots of public records that have been preserved over the years. The Colony of Virginia, because he was an official. He was the commanding officer of the Virginia Militia. And then he was a member of the House of Burgesses. So the acts of the state legislature have lots of information about him.
What's the House of Burgesses?
Oh, that's the colonial legislature. So before Virginia was independent, it did have its own elected legislature, and Washington was elected as a member in his 20s. Continental Congress has records, and then obviously the public records from his terms as president. The recent biographies, Joseph Ellis wrote one in 2004, and Chernow is the most recent and most definitive, and it is, I can tell you, I found it fascinating, and I learned a lot of stuff about him I did not know before. So I'm going to do this in 8 acts, and we'll talk about his ancestors, his youth, the young squire and military officer that'll get us through his 20s, husband, planter, legislator for about 15 years. He's simply a farmer. And he has a lot of land, several thousand acres. And then in 1775, he gets the call, becomes commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. That conflict lasts for 8 years. He's 43 when he gets that appointment, and he's 51 when he finally resigns his commission. He goes back to Mount Vernon, which he had no idea it would be 8 years. And for 3 or 4 years, he went back to being a gentleman farmer. And then the Constitutional Convention was meeting, and he was cajoled into coming, and of course they wanted him to preside, and then when they were writing the article about the powers of the presidency, everybody is looking at him, and he is elected president by the Electoral College unanimously.
Did anybody run against him?
Yes. because each of the electors in those days had 2 votes, and you didn't differentiate between who you were voting for president and vice president. The instructions were each elector vote for 2 people. Whoever comes in first is president. Whoever comes in second will be vice president. So he got a unanimous vote. Every single elector voted for him, and then they split their votes amongst a bunch of people. John Adams came in second, and he was a little miffed. But anyway. So then after serving 2 terms, he went back home to Virginia, where he was once again a husband, a planter, and a grandfather. The house was full of kids. We'll talk about his family quite a bit. Let me talk about his ancestors. His great-grandfather, John Washington, came over from England in the mid-1600s. His grandfather was named Lawrence, died young, but married very fortunately. Mildred brought about 750 acres as her dowry. Lawrence had actually gone back to England. His father sent him back to England to attend prep school in Cumbria, which is just north of the Lake District. And then when he was 20, he came back to Virginia and was a planter, a country squire, a self-taught attorney, justice of the peace. He was a member of the colonial legislature and was sheriff of the county for quite some time. So, and his wife, Mildred, her father had been the speaker of the legislature, the highest elected official. So they're kind of a power couple. Hello now. Come on. Next slide. There we go. So, Augustine Washington. That is Washington's father. And he was only 4 when his father Lawrence died. His mother died 4 years later when he was 9. He got sent back to England to attend the same grammar school that his father had. By the way, that school is still in existence. They have a nice little plaque talking about the ancestors of George Washington who attended their school. Got a classical education with a heavy emphasis in Latin. Gus, or Gus Sr., because there's another Augustine later on, inherited 1,100 acres from his father when he died. And his first wife brought another 1,700 acres. So they're doing quite well. And with his first wife, he had 4 children, 3 of whom survived infancy, but a daughter who died at 14, leaving really only 2 sons. And his wife died in 1729. They were married for 14 years. By the way, Lawrence and the second one. So it's Lawrence, Augustine, and who are father and son, and Lawrence and Augustine, who are brothers. These 2 brothers, whose grandfather was Lawrence and father was Augustine, they went back to Cumbria, to the same grammar school in England, and got educated. So Augustine marries a second time, Mary Ball. And Mary Ball had been orphaned. She was a ward. And they have their first child, whom they named George, not for the King of England. He's named George because after she was orphaned, her guardian was named George Eskin. Her guardian is the one who introduced her to Augustine Washington. Augustine was 48 at the time of his second marriage, and she was 23. And they had 6 children. So, but Jane died, Mildred died, and Augustine died. And so the speculation is that if his father had not died, George probably would have been sent back to England, to the academy in Cumbria, to get an education. But he wasn't, and he felt sort of acutely at a disadvantage for most of his life because he had never really had any formal schooling beyond being instructed at home. But he had these 2 older half-brothers and 3 younger brothers and a younger sister that he grew up with. And the family at this point was wealthy. They owned 3 plantations, about 5,000 acres, not all in one place, but there was the Little Hunting Creek Farm and the upper reaches of the Potomac, the Ferry Farm just opposite Fredericksburg, which is where George grew up, and the Pope's Creek Farm. And so his two older brothers got the Little Hunting Creek Farm, that was Lawrence, and Gus Jr. got the Pope's Creek Farm. George got the Ferry Creek Farm, which is right across the Rappahannock from the little town of Fredericksburg. He also got some lots in the city, but he was only 11. And so his mother is his guardian, and he won't come into that land until he gets 18. His older brother, Lawrence, had been commissioned as an officer in the Virginia Militia and sent on an English military expedition when they were fighting the War of Jenkins' Ear with the Spanish. And they attacked Cartagena de Caribe, which was a big Spanish port on the coast of the colony of Colombia. These are all still Spanish colonies. It failed miserably, but it was Lawrence's first taste in his 20s of military service. And he was a great admirer of the commanding officer of that British expedition, who was Admiral Vernon. And so when he inherited the Little Hunting Creek Farm, he changed the name of it to Mount Vernon. And it's on the banks of the Potomac. It sits, if anybody's ever been to Mount Vernon, it sits kind of up on a bluff with a nice vista, a look out across. So, I mean, it's hardly a mountain, but it is a little raised bluff. And it's Lawrence, and it looked like, okay, so the three brothers, the oldest of the second set of children, and the two brothers from the first family are going to divide up the three big farms, and that will be the way things go. And the farm is held in trust for him and managed by his mother, whom he didn't get along with. In the absence of a father and with a mother who doled out criticism more freely than encouragement, George Washington naturally turned to his three younger brothers for recreation and his two older brothers, Lawrence and Austin. Augustine's name got shortened to Austin for guidance. That's from Chernow's biography. So at 14, his father's died. He's living with his mother. They've got a farm, real estate in Virginia. He briefly considered joining the British Navy. There was a Royal frigate anchored in the Potomac, and his older brother sent word to George there was a position as a midshipman available if he wanted it. And George's mother said, absolutely not, under no circumstances. George apparently wanted to take advantage, but he was 14, so he couldn't do it without his mother's permission. At 15, he resolved to become a surveyor. He was proficient in math, and he was fond of the outdoors. His father had left behind a complete set of surveying instruments at the Ferry Farm. George began by surveying the boundaries of his own farm, and then he apprenticed to a local surveyor and earned his first wages. In his diary, he kept track of the money he made and the expenses that he had to undergo, and he became very good at surveying. And because through his mother and his two older brothers, they are all plantation owners, he came to the attention of the Fairfax family, who actually had huge tracts of land that had been granted to them over the Alleghanies and the Shenandoah Valley, and they hired him to go out and survey their lands. So that's his connection with the Fairfax family. He was employed by Baron Fairfax to survey lands in the Shenandoah Valley and lay out parcels that could be sold. He also had an eye out for land that he could buy, good farming land at reasonable prices that might appreciate over time. And so he actually, by the time he was 20, he had acquired over 1,000 acres in his own name. He took some of his surveying fees sometimes. So instead of paying me, I'll take some of these lots that I've laid out for you. At 17, he was appointed surveyor for Culpeper County, and we have one survey in the county records that he signed. Apparently, he did not do a lot. He was not called on to do a lot because he continued to survey different parcels of land for the Fairfax family. By 20, yes, he owned 2,315 acres in the Shenandoah Valley. So here's our 20-year-old backwoodsman. He dressed a whole lot more like Daniel Boone than like a member of the legislature. He wasn't yet. He was a young backwoodsman who knew his way around in the wild. Carrying a musket and surveying equipment and dealing with Indians and bears and whatever else was necessary. And then his older half-brother became ill. By May of 1749, he showed signs of tuberculosis. He went to England for treatment. George accompanied him to Berkeley Springs in Virginia. That was a typical course that people sometimes undertook trying to recover. Didn't work. 1751, George went with Lawrence to Barbados seeking a cure. This was Washington's only trip outside North America. He was 19, and he went with his older half-brother to the Caribbean, and after 3 weeks came back to Virginia. It's actually his only sea voyage. Lawrence then went to Bermuda and then returned to Virginia. He died in July of 1752 at the age of 34. George was 20. And the interesting thing is, by the terms of his will, he bequeathed Mount Vernon to his wife Anne as a life estate and to his infant daughter. But if she died without an heir, then George would inherit. And she died the next year of smallpox. His daughter died of smallpox in 1754. Anne had a life tenancy in Mount Vernon, but leased the farm to George after the death of his daughter Shearer. He was 22, and now he's got the Ferry farm he inherited, and now he has Mount Vernon as well. When Anne remarried, of course, a life tenancy only exists as long as you don't marry someone else. When she married again, then George took full ownership of Mount Vernon at the age of 25. Lawrence had been adjutant general with the Virginia Militia ever since his sermon with Admiral Vernon. After his death, George lobbied the governor to be appointed to that position, and he won. Adjutant general of the Virginia Militia a few days before his 21st birthday. And that same year, in October, the governor sent him as an envoy to deliver an ultimatum to the French, demanding that they abandon their forts in the Ohio River Valley. Spent 6 weeks traveling through the wilderness with a small party. The French rejected the ultimatum, and he then spent 6 weeks returning. But he wrote a report for the governor, which was then published first in Williamsburg and then in London, the Journal of Major George Washington. And he got kind of a bit of local fame as this young backwoods military officer in the colonial militia who had told the French to buzz off. The French, of course, ignored him. A month after his return from the mission to the French, the governor promoted him from major to lieutenant colonel just before his 22nd birthday. Lieutenant colonel at 22 is something. Yes. He makes a second trip the next year. Reports reached Williamsburg of a French raiding party marching toward the forks of the Ohio. Washington was ordered to intercept. He had 160 militia to back him up. As he led an early morning patrol of 40 men, there was a skirmish with a party of French. 10 French soldiers were killed, 22 captured. 1 Virginia militiaman was killed and 2 were wounded. French commanding officer was killed. This turned out to be a scandal. Washington began digging trenches in a stockade. The main French force of 1,200 soldiers arrived and overwhelmed the Virginia Militia Company. They'd been reinforced up to 300, but they were outnumbered 4-1. And so they were forced to surrender. And the French said, "Go home, boy." But he signed a statement in French that they insisted upon. And he didn't realize that in the statement, which was in French and he didn't speak French, he admitted to assassinating the French officer who had been killed. And that kind of came back to haunt him. By the way, he said on the anniversary of the date on which he had been forced to surrender to the French was a grim and dark day for him. And for the rest of his life, he never felt happy when that day rolled around. It was July 4th, 1754. Yeah. Okay, third trip to the wilderness. The English were like, well, the militia may have had a hard time with the French, but we'll send a party of British regulars. We'll send 2 regiments, 2,000 men, to evict the French from the French Valley under the command of Major General Braddock. Braddock accepted Lieutenant Colonel Washington as an advisor. Braddock's force was ambushed by French and Indian warriors and massacred. Braddock was mortally wounded. Washington was desperately trying to get the British to break ranks and take cover behind the trees. Braddock kept trying to line them all up shoulder to shoulder to fire at the French. The French and the Indians were picking them off from behind trees and rocks, and yeah, it was a disaster. Washington's hat and uniform had 4 bullet holes, and he had 2 horses killed, but he was unscathed. Governor Dinwiddie promoted him from lieutenant colonel to full colonel. He ordered Washington to organize the militia and build forts to protect the frontier. So he's the young hero now of several military campaigns. He's in his early 20s and begins courting Martha Dandridge. Apparently, the infatuation with Sally Fairfax wore off. She was 8 months older than him, but they were essentially born within the year. She had married first at age 18 to Daniel Parke Custis. He was 39. They had 4 children. 2 died in childhood, and her husband died after 7 years of marriage. So she and George are both now 27. They got married in January 1759, and they were a power couple because she had several thousand acres, and George had several thousand acres, and he adopted her children. They were rich landowners, yeah. So for the next 15 years, and he resigned his commission. Although he was elected to the colonial legislature, he did accompany the second British expedition to the forks of the Ohio. As they got there, they discovered the French had withdrawn and burnt their fort. So the British built a fort there and named it for the Prime Minister of England, who at the time was William Pitt. So it's the forks of the Ohio is where the Monongahela and the Susquehanna come together and form the Ohio. 3 rivers together, which is why when they built a professional football stadium there, they named it 3 Rivers Stadium, because it's at the forks of the Ohio where the French had built a fort and then burned it, and then the British built a fort, named it after Pitt, and it became Pittsburgh. Washington returned home after that. This is when he resigned, and got married. So in the 1760s, I'm running out of time. There's way too much of Washington for me to cover. 1760s is the period where the colonists and the British government are increasingly out of sorts, increasing tension. Parliament issued a proclamation barring settlement west of the Alleghenies. They wanted to stop all the fighting with the French and the Indians. And then to pay for the expeditions they'd already sent, they started to tax the colonists. And there is a long-standing principle in British common law that Parliament can impose a tax, but the king cannot without the consent of the people through their representatives in Parliament. And the colonists said that principle applies to us as well. Our colonial legislatures can pass a tax on us, but the king and Parliament in London, where we have no representation, cannot tax us. So these acts, and they're all tax acts, were more and more irritating and intolerable. They actually called 1774 the Intolerable Acts. That was their nickname, because the British closed the port of Boston, quartered troops, and demanded that the city of Boston pay for the tea that had been dumped into the harbor, which leads to the convening of the First Continental Congress. George Washington elected as one of 7 delegates from Virginia at the age of 42. Yeah, it's just the 60s, things were heating up. AI suggested, there's an AI now inside PowerPoint. The AI in PowerPoint suggested this would be a better way to show that. I don't know that I agree. Yes?
You didn't mention it at the time. I don't want to get too far ahead, but Martha Dandridge was from Dandridge, Tennessee.
Yes.
And that's what the city's named after.
Yeah.
Is George Washington.
Martha Dandridge Custis. Her husband was Custis. Martha Dandridge Custis, Washington. Yeah. All right. So in 1775, there is Lexington and Concord. Before the Declaration of Independence, there's shooting breaks out between the Massachusetts militia and British regulars. And it's because they're trying to arrest 2 leaders of the colonial legislature and trying to confiscate the militia's powder reserves. They're trying to confiscate the weapons of the Massachusetts militia. And it comes to bullets. So they then drive the British regiments back into Boston, and the British regiments in Boston are essentially under siege. Continental Congress then is debating over whether to adopt the Massachusetts militia as an army of all 13 colonies, or whether we just let them do their thing. Not everybody agreed that what the Massachusetts militia had done ought to even be approved of. But they do a single resolution. They adopt the Massachusetts militia, and they appoint George Washington of Virginia as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, which surprised everybody. The Massachusetts delegation apparently thought it would be one of them who was appointed general, and they appoint this guy from Virginia. Well, Washington had shown up at the Continental Congress. He put back on his militia uniform. When he showed up as a delegate from Virginia, he's the only one in military uniform. And there's a moment in the John Adams HBO series, which I'm very fond of, and does do a good job of historical accuracy, where I think it's Franklin is pointing Washington out to Adams, and Adams comments on the uniform, and Franklin says, well, he's always the tallest guy in the crowd. He's bound to wind up leading something. So there he is. And he goes to Boston, takes command of the Massachusetts militia. Over the next 2 or 3 years, fights a number of battles, some of which he wins, some of which he loses, some of which he has to retreat from. Never a complete or overwhelming victory against the British, but he always manages to preserve his army and keep it from being surrounded or annihilated. That second winter at Valley Forge is famous. I won't spend any time on that because there's a whole lot else I want to talk about. They retake Philadelphia in 78, and they actually smacked the British at Monmouth, New Jersey, as they're trying to retreat from Philadelphia back to New York. But after that, the British shift to the Southern campaign under Cornwallis. They had a major defeat that Washington did not play any part in at Saratoga, a British army that had marched north toward Canada, was supposed to be joined by another force coming south from Canada, and the New England militiamen hid behind trees and picked them off, to the point that they finally, when they got to a pitched battle, they were so weakened and had been in the wilderness for so long that they were overwhelmed, and the entire British army was forced to surrender. There was some rivalry. The generals who participated in that campaign began to think of themselves as more qualified than Washington to command the army, and so he had a lot of politics to deal with. Southern campaign, Savannah, Charleston, Camden. Kings Mountain is the first time in the Southern militia, the Southern militia actually inflict a defeat on the British. Same thing at Cowpens, although the British Army is now evacuating South Carolina. They'd been there for 2.5 years and been unable to subdue the state, and so Cornwallis was marching his men north to rejoin the main British forces in Philadelphia and New York. And at Guilford Courthouse, they suffered another defeat, and they finally got to Yorktown, expecting the British fleet to come south from New York and pick them up and take those regiments back to New York City, which was their remaining major base amongst the colonies. Washington found out. He had sent Lafayette. I could spend a whole hour talking about Lafayette. He sent Lafayette, who, with a small force, besieged Cornwallis in Yorktown. Cornwallis is waiting for the British fleet to come down and pick him up. And then Washington engaged in a bit of deception, because he had spent 2 or 3 years really without fighting any battles, just guarding the British troops in New York. He hadn't been able to take New York. It was too heavily fortified, and there were too many British regiments there. But he had his men in an arc around New York, watching, hoping, if they tried to venture out, he would be able to engage them. He actually fakes them out, leaves in the middle of the night, marches south. In about 4 weeks, they get all the way down to Yorktown. He heard of the French fleet having driven off the British. The British did send the fleet from New York, and the French fleet was already there. They engaged in a naval battle, and the French had to return to New York, which meant Cornwallis was really stuck now. He rode to Mount Vernon, because it was on the way. It was the first time he'd seen his home in 6 years, and he only spent one night there. Reached Yorktown on September 26th. Cornwallis surrendered about 4 weeks later, when it became clear. And after the surrender in 1781, nothing more happens. Sort of a tense standoff. It takes almost a year for peace talks to start in Paris between English and American representatives. There's finally a peace treaty signed in 1783, which is slightly less than 2 years after Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown. The British evacuated New York. Washington marched in with the Continental Army, which was a huge triumphal procession. And in December of that year, he resigned his commission and went home, which surprised a lot of people because they thought, well, now that they've won their independence, surely he's going to be the leader of the colonies. He went home. George and Martha at this point are 52. They're guardians for their 2 youngest grandchildren. Nellie was 4 and Washi was 2. He's actually named Washington, yeah, but they called him Washi. And George and Martha just doted on them. In addition, one of Martha's nieces had been orphaned and taken in. 4 of Washington's nephews also came to live with them. Mount Vernon consisted of 5 separate farms totaling 7,000 acres. And George's habit was to get up every morning at sunrise, saddle his horse, and he would spend the morning making a circuit of the 5 farms, checking on the overseers and the work being done in each of those. And he did that every day. And there were always visitors and guests, as you might imagine. He received rents from his extensive holdings in the Ohio Valley. He diversified. Tobacco never really worked out for him very well as a cash crop. He grew wheat, barley, oats, rye, clover, timothy, corn, pumpkins, potatoes, turnips, peas, and flax. But he never made a lot of money at farming. His fortune, his money, his cash came from the sale of lands, which he recently had to resort to. Lafayette came for a visit, 1784. Madison and Hamilton, who had been officers serving under him in the Continental Army, were frequent visitors. There was an Annapolis conference in September of 1786, which he did not attend, but he kept tabs on, which called for a convention to amend the Articles of Confederation for the next summer. Madison told him the Virginia legislature wanted to send him as the head, that's a typo, as the head of their delegation to the convention. And he reluctantly agreed to the appointment. The convention unanimously elected him as presiding officer on the first day. And once again, he wore his Virginia militia military uniform. He was 55 when the Constitutional Convention began. The Constitution was drafted that summer, ratified by the states the next year, implemented the following year. I'm going to skip over all of this. This is more familiar territory. The Electoral College cast votes for the first time in January 1789. It's a little bit off. It should have been 1788, but the Electoral College voted Washington unanimously as president. Congress certified his election in April, and he was sworn in April 30th, 1789, in New York City. So that's where the government was located. Secretaries of Treasury and War, 2 of his officers, Hamilton, who had been a military officer and his military secretary, and Henry Knox, who had been his commander of artillery. He nominated all 6 of the first Supreme Court justices. He did a tour of the New England states. He said one of his resolves as president was to tour all 13 of the colonies, which he did. Didn't appoint an attorney general until February 1790, and he told him there's not a lot of legal business for you, so you can practice law on the side. And he did, because there wasn't a lot of legal stuff for the attorney general to do. It wasn't until March of 1790 that he appointed a secretary of state, who was Thomas Jefferson, who had come back. He had been our ambassador in Paris. 1790, the federal capital moved from New York to Philadelphia, but they had already agreed that they were going to build a new capital on the banks of the Potomac. He toured the southern states in 1791. Hamilton's financial plan, establishing a national bank, taking care of consolidating all of the state or the colonial debts and paying it all back, and beginning to impose the first federal taxes. Tariffs on goods coming into the country at first were all they had. The first federal tax on anything internal was a tax on distilled whiskey. You had to get a license to operate a still, and you had to pay a per gallon excise tax of 9 cents per gallon, which provoked a rebellion. The Electoral College met again in 1792. Congress certified in 1790. By the way, he won the second election unanimously. He was inaugurated for his second term. He apparently, when he first accepted the role as president, he wrote in his diary and to several of his friends that he did not expect to serve the full term, that he really only was agreeable to serving until the government was established and up and running. And then he would resign in favor of whoever was the vice president, go home to Mount Vernon. And he doesn't come right out and say it. Chernow actually says it. He says if he had known that he would have to serve for 8 years, he probably would not have accepted, because he always wanted to get back to Mount Vernon, and he made frequent trips. When the revolution broke out in France and war broke out between France and England, he staunchly proclaimed neutrality from the United States of America, which infuriated a lot of Americans and infuriated Jefferson. Jefferson actually resigned as Secretary of State over Washington's neutrality proclamation. The Whiskey Rebellion, 1794. The folks in western Pennsylvania didn't want to haul their wheat and flour to market because it was a whole lot easier to distill it into whiskey and take it in barrels. You make more money. And so they really objected to having to license their stills and to pay a federal excise tax. And there was a rebellion. They actually tarred and feathered some of the federal revenuers, and an army, some of them veterans of the Continental Army, assembled, and Washington called out the militia from Virginia and North Carolina and Maryland, and actually led the militia himself. He's the only U.S. president to lead troops in the field as president. Of course, the Constitution names the president as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but no other president has ever actually gone out and led troops in the field. He led troops to western Pennsylvania, and by the time he got to Carlisle, it just kind of dissolved. They eventually arrested 150 people. They dismissed the charges against most of them. 2 of them were convicted of rebellion and treason and sentenced to death, and Washington pardoned both of them.
Wasn't Washington famous for rye whiskey? He had his own kind of...
Oh, yeah, he had a distillery in Mount Vernon. Yeah, one of his overseers. He got an overseer from Scotland who said, we need to do our own whiskey because a lot of these other crops are not paying off. So Washington said, I don't know anything about it, but go ahead. I don't know whether we still make Mount Vernon whiskey or not, but for a while it was a thing. For a while it was the largest distillery in the United States at Mount Vernon. His political successes: elected as commander-in-chief, unanimous by the Continental Congress. Elected to preside the Constitutional Convention, unanimous. Elected president in 1788 by the electors, unanimous. Re-elected president in 1792, unanimous. Just amazing. He made a farewell address in 1796. His term ended March 4th. John Adams was then sworn in as the second president. At 65, he's finally able to go home. But he was not very popular at that point. His refusal to assist the French and the perception that he favored Britain over France meant that he and John Jay and some of the other members of his cabinet were being burned in effigy. And there were crowds outside the residence in Philadelphia. And the scene from John Adams is absolutely accurate, where he told Adams, I'm tired of it. I'm going back to Mount Vernon. I have been popular, and now I know what it is to be unpopular. I'm going home. And he was attacked by a number of scurrilous newspaper writers. There was a great deal of disinformation being published about him. His first year, I've got a misspelling there for Mount Vernon. Wow. And then in 1798, things heated up. Under Adams, there was a threat that the French might actually land troops. And so Adams appointed Washington as commander-in-chief, and he had to come out of retirement. He went to Philadelphia, and he and Hamilton started figuring out who they were going to appoint as officers. It all went away, and he went back to Mount Vernon, but he only really had 1 year left then. On December 12, 1799, he got up to make his daily ride to the 5 farms, and it snowed that day. And he came home soaked, and there were guests, and so he didn't even bother to change his clothes, his wet clothes. He sat at the midday meal for them. The next day, he got up and walked the grounds around the house, walked down to the Potomac, marked out a path, marked trees that he wanted taken down to improve the view. And that night, he ran a high fever and had difficulty breathing. When he woke up on the 14th, and he died later that afternoon in his room. 2 doctors, 4 servants, and Martha at his bedside at the age of 67. And was buried in the family tomb on the grounds. There was no big, large public ceremony, although there was a memorial service at which, in the eulogy, one of his officers made the sort of stirring, ringing pronouncement about him that he was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. It was Richard Henry Lee, Robert E. Lee's father. So there he is at 44, 57, and 64. And I'll kind of stand by the AI portrait. I think that's probably pretty accurate. I asked the AI to do it in New York City, so that's a background there of the city at his inauguration. There's a whole lot more that could be said about him, but he's a much more three-dimensional figure than I think we commonly perceive, and he had a much richer and more widely varied life, especially as a young man, especially the experience that he gained in the wilderness and the experience he gained as a young officer in his 20s, and then his attempts to be a farmer. He always wanted to be a farmer. But he was courageous, he was accomplished, and his leadership of the Continental Army, he was not tactically brilliant, but he was strategically brilliant. Strategically, he knew that if they lost a major battle with the British, the whole revolution would collapse. If they ever had to surrender to British forces, it would be over. And so he always had that strategic guideline in the back of his mind, so that many of his battles were fought with an eye toward, okay, I can fight, I can maneuver here, but I cannot get caught or surrounded or outflanked where they can force me to surrender. And he succeeded. He kept the army together against incredible odds. All right. We're going to continue next month with another figure that we all know a lot about, but I promise you there are some surprises. I hope there were a few surprises tonight about George Washington. Yes, ma'am.
People used to talk about he had wooden teeth.
He did have dentures. He went through a number of different attempts. Carved whalebone, wooden. Yeah, I mean, he by the end of his life, he had only one of his teeth left. And so he was dependent, and there's some correspondence with his dentist back and forth about, and they were put together with springs, which were difficult. Yeah. I mean, you can sort of.
Did any of his kids or his grandkids keep the farmland and keep it going as a farm?
Yes, the Mount Vernon stayed in the family. Of course, he had no children. He and Martha never had any children of their own, but he adopted Martha's children from her first marriage, and they inherited. And then both of her children, her surviving children, she only had 2, a boy and a girl. They had died before Washington, but he had adopted the grandchildren. One of the grandchildren, Washi, went on to inherit a site in Arlington and built a huge monument to Washington on top of the hill at Arlington overlooking Washington, D.C., and his daughter married Robert E. Lee. And so Arlington Cemetery is the former plantation of Washington's grandson, Washi. And Robert E. Lee lived there with his wife up until the Civil War. It was turned into a cemetery as a deliberate insult to the Lees. They basically buried Union dead in his front yard so that he would never be able to come back or wouldn't want to.
The Indians thought that he was a spirit for,
Washington?
yeah.
Well, they thought he had a spirit that protected him. There is a famous meeting because of the battle with Braddock, where he had, there were 4 bullet holes in his clothes, and 2 horses had been killed. And one of the Indians met him 10 or 15 years later and said, "Yeah, we watched you." And all of the chiefs who were fighting with the French decided that there was a spirit protecting you from harm. Yes, sir.
Another story I heard, after one combat, the opponent came to him and said, "Sir, we can't fight you because I personally shot 17 bullets at you and nothing happened." And then he found his robe had 17 bullet holes.
I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. There is a core truth to that in the battle with Braddock in his 20s in the wilderness, he did have bullet holes in his clothes, at least 4, but was not wounded. I think that got spun in the 19th century into some hyperbolic, exaggerations of that. But the fact that he had 2 horses shot out from under him, killed, and his servant brought him a 3rd horse, and that they found bullet holes in his hat and in his coat, and one through one of the pants legs. And the story of the Indian chief making that comment to him years later at a meeting, that's pretty well corroborated. The Indian chief said, "We decided there was a spirit protecting you from harm." Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming out on a Tuesday night. I hope this was informative and helpful. And come back next month, and I'll tell you a few anecdotes about Abraham Lincoln.
Sound like a plan. Thank you, sir.
You're very welcome.